Late summer 1944, France. Allied forces under George S. Patton had encircled a German fortress commanding a vital road network. Ancient stone walls, elevated firing positions, artillery covering every avenue of approach. Inside, a German commander and his garrison, dug in and defiant, with orders to hold at all costs. Patton sent negotiators under white flag with standard terms. Surrender now. Be treated as prisoners of war under Geneva Convention protections, and survive this war. The German commander's response was absolute, delivered without hesitation, without room for interpretation. Tell General Patton that if he wants this fortress, he'll have to kill me to get it. It was meant to sound heroic, unshakable, the kind of vow that rallies troops and forces enemies to reconsider their plans. Patton's response changed everything. I can arrange that. What followed wasn't a siege. It wasn't a prolonged negotiation or a costly frontal assault. It was a methodical, overwhelming operation that lasted days, not weeks, and demonstrated that Patton never treated defiance as theater. He treated it as a preference, and honored it exactly. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. The fortress wasn't some improvised strongpoint thrown together during retreat. It was a legitimate defensive position. Thick stone construction, commanding high ground, limited approaches that could be covered by interlocking fields of fire, supply caches that could sustain a garrison for weeks. The German commander had sworn publicly and privately to hold it to the end, and his position gave him reason for confidence. On paper, the fortress was formidable. A direct assault would be bloody. A traditional siege could drag on for weeks, consuming time and resources. The logical option might be to bypass it entirely, leave a screening force, and maintain momentum. But this fortress controlled a key road junction. Leaving it in German hands meant American supply convoys would face dangerous detours and delays. It was an obstacle that couldn't be ignored, and Patton's operational clock was ticking. Every hour mattered. Patton's philosophy was consistent. Offer surrender first. Not out of sentimentality, though he wasn't needlessly cruel, but out of efficiency. A surrendered position costs 0 American casualties and takes 0 time. A contested position costs both. So he always gave commanders one clear choice: end this cleanly or define how force will be applied. When the German commander chose defiance, he didn't understand what he'd actually done. He thought he was intimidating the Americans. He thought he was buying time or respect. Instead, he'd just removed the final restraint. The fortress was not a relic. It was a calculation. Built centuries earlier, when wars moved at the speed of marching armies, it had been designed to control movement through the region. The roads it overlooked weren't suggestions. They were the only practical routes for mechanized columns moving supplies, reinforcements, and ammunition forward to divisions already deep inside France. Bypassing it meant adding miles, sometimes dozens of miles, to every convoy route. It meant exposing supply trucks to ambush on narrow secondary roads. It meant slowing the tempo of advance at precisely the moment when speed was everything. And in late summer 1944, tempo was the war. Patton's Third Army was racing across France faster than anyone had predicted. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to keep pace or the advance would stall. Every hour counted. Every mile mattered. The fortress wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a choke point that could strangle logistics and turn momentum into stagnation. The Germans understood this perfectly. The position itself was a natural strong point, elevated above the surrounding terrain. Thick stone walls absorbed small arms fire and shell fragments. Firing positions were cut into the structure at intervals that allowed defenders to cover every approach with interlocking machine gun fire. Artillery pieces had been positioned to sweep the open ground below. Attackers would have to cross exposed fields under direct observation, then assault uphill against prepared defenses with limited cover. Conventional tactics, infantry advance supported by artillery, would work eventually, but the cost would be measured in days and casualties. The German commander knew this. His confidence wasn't bravado. It was rooted in stone, elevation, and the mathematics of defensive warfare. He had supplies. He had ammunition. He had men willing to fight, or at least willing to obey. And he had history on his side. Fortresses like this one had held out against far larger forces in previous wars. But history had been written before Patton. For the Americans, the fortress represented more than a tactical problem. It was a test of will and capability. Taking it quickly would prove that momentum could overcome fortification. Failing to take it, or worse, getting bogged down in a prolonged siege, would signal weakness and invite resistance elsewhere. The fortress had become a symbol. And symbols, in war, have a way of mattering more than stone. Patton's staff understood the stakes. They also understood their commander. There would be no bypass. No screening force left behind while the main advance continued. No acceptance of delay. The fortress would fall. The only question was how much American blood it would cost. That calculation changed the moment the German commander refused to surrender. Because Patton's planners were no longer constrained by the need to preserve lives on both sides. They were no longer operating under the assumption that negotiation remained possible. The German commander had made his choice clear. Patton accepted it. Patton did not believe in unnecessary killing. He believed in necessary winning. The distinction mattered. It shaped every decision he made, every order he gave, every conversation he had with enemy commanders through white flag intermediaries. War, in Patton's view, was not about demonstrating courage or testing resolve. It was about achieving objectives as quickly and efficiently as possible. Speed saved lives. Clarity prevented confusion. Consequences taught lessons that words alone could not. This was why he always offered surrender first. Not out of mercy, though he was capable of it. Not out of moral obligation, though he respected the laws of war. He offered surrender because it was the fastest route to victory. A garrison that surrendered cost him nothing. No time, no ammunition, no casualties. A garrison that resisted cost all three. The math was simple. The choice was theirs. But once that choice was made, Patton treated it as final. He had seen too many commanders in previous wars waste days negotiating with enemies who had no intention of surrendering. He had watched sieges drag on because attackers feared the political cost of applying overwhelming force. He had witnessed hesitation disguised as humanitarianism, and he knew it killed more men in the long run than decisive action ever did. Patton's philosophy eliminated that hesitation. If you refuse to surrender, you are stating a preference. You are choosing how this engagement will end. And I will honor that choice exactly. This was not cruelty. It was clarity. The German commander's declaration, "You'll have to kill me," was not a threat in Patton's mind. It was an instruction. The man had communicated his decision in the clearest possible terms. He had removed ambiguity. He had closed the door on negotiation and opened the door to force. Patton simply walked through it. There was no anger in his response, no frustration, no sense of insult or wounded pride. The German commander had not offended him. He had informed him. and Patton responded the way he always did. When given clear information, he adjusted his plan accordingly. Where other commanders might have seen defiance as a challenge to be overcome through persuasion or intimidation, Patton saw it as a logistical update. The fortress would not be taken through negotiation. Therefore, it would be taken through force. The question was no longer if, but how quickly. His staff understood this immediately. Orders shifted from containment to destruction. Artillery units were repositioned, assault plans were finalized, timelines were compressed. The operation moved from theoretical to imminent. Symbolic defiance meant nothing to Patton. Words meant to sound heroic did not impress him. What mattered was whether those words changed the operational reality, and in this case, they had. The German commander had traded away his only leverage, the possibility that Patton might hesitate. He would not hesitate. The fortress had declared its fate. Patton had accepted those terms. And now, with the clarity that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done, American forces prepared to demonstrate what happened when efficiency met defiance. The German commander believed he had drawn a line. He had declared his resolve. He had shown his troops that he would not be intimidated. What he did not understand was that Patton never tried to intimidate anyone. He simply kept his promises. The first thing American forces did was make the fortress disappear from the war. Not physically. The stone walls still stood, the German flag still flew, the defenders still manned their positions. But strategically, operationally, the fortress ceased to exist as part of the larger German defensive network. Within hours of the commander's refusal, American units moved to seal every approach. Infantry companies established positions on roads leading away from the fortress. Reconnaissance patrols cut communication lines. Artillery observers took positions on distant ridges with clear lines of sight to the walls. The encirclement was not dramatic. There were no massed assaults, no grand maneuvers. It was methodical, professional, and absolutely thorough. Every route in or out was covered. Every position that might offer support to the fortress was identified and marked for elimination. The Germans inside could see it happening. From their elevated position, they watched American forces move across the landscape like a tightening net. Outlying German positions, farmhouses, crossroads, small villages that had provided early warning and mutual support, went silent one by one. Some fell after brief firefights. Others surrendered when they realized no help was coming. A few simply withdrew under cover of darkness, abandoning equipment and positions rather than be cut off themselves. Each loss narrowed the fortress's world. Where German observers had once been able to see friendly positions miles away, they now saw only American-controlled territory. Where radio traffic had once carried reports from neighboring units, there was now only static or silence. The broader battle, the one that mattered, the one that determined whether Germany won or lost this war, continued without them. They were no longer participants. They were spectators, watching their own irrelevance unfold. Supply became a distant memory. No convoys would reach them. No reinforcements would arrive. The ammunition they had was all they would ever have. The food in their stores would not be replenished. The wounded would receive no evacuation. Every resource was finite now. Every decision carried the weight of permanence. American forces did not rush. They established observation posts with clear views of the fortress walls. They positioned heavy weapons within range, but held fire. They waited, visible and patient, while the psychological pressure built. The message was unmistakable. You are alone. Inside the fortress, that truth settled over the garrison like fog. Conversations grew quieter. Men watched the perimeter obsessively, searching for signs of movement that never came from friendly forces. Officers tried to maintain routines, but routines felt hollow when everyone understood the situation had fundamentally changed. The fortress was no longer holding a position. It was occupying a grave that hadn't been filled yet. The German commander attempted to project confidence. He issued orders, inspected defenses, reminded his men of their oath and their duty. But confidence requires belief in eventual relief or victory, and neither seemed possible anymore. The Americans weren't even attacking. They were simply there, surrounding the fortress like a fence around a condemned building, waiting, watching, preparing for what came next. Escape was impossible. Reinforcement was fantasy. Negotiation had been rejected by their own commander. The noose had tightened, and everyone inside could feel it. The walls held, the guns still worked, supplies remained adequate. But something inside the fortress had begun to crack. It started with questions no one dared ask aloud, whispered in corners during guard shifts, exchanged through glances when officers weren't watching. Simple questions with dangerous answers. Why are we still here? What are we accomplishing? How does this end? The German commander had given his men a clear narrative. They were holding a vital position, delaying the American advance, buying time for German forces to regroup elsewhere. It was the story soldiers needed to believe, that their sacrifice served a larger purpose. But the Americans surrounding them told a different story. They moved supplies past the fortress without concern. Their convoys took alternate routes and continued forward. The war flowed around the fortress like water around a stone, and everyone inside could see it. They weren't delaying anything. They weren't protecting anyone. They were simply trapped. Junior officers began approaching their commander with carefully worded suggestions. Perhaps terms could be renegotiated. Perhaps a tactical withdrawal under cover of darkness. Perhaps some alternative to waiting for the inevitable. The commander's response was always the same: absolute rejection. He had given his word. He had made a vow. Surrender was not an option, and anyone who suggested otherwise was questioning German honor. The first time he said it, it sounded like leadership. By the fifth time, it sounded like fear. Discipline, which had been maintained through respect and shared purpose, began to require enforcement. Men who spoke of surrender were reprimanded publicly. Sentries who abandoned posts faced threats of court-martial. The commander's presence, once reassuring, became a source of tension. He was no longer leading them toward anything. He was simply preventing them from leaving. Enlisted men began to understand what their officers already knew. The commander's defiance had trapped them all. His vow, meant to inspire courage, had become a chain. They would die, not because the position mattered, but because one man's pride would not allow him to admit he had miscalculated. The fortress had enough food for weeks, enough ammunition for days of fighting, but it had run out of reasons. Some men still believed in the mission, or at least in their duty. They would follow orders until the end, not because they expected victory, but because that's what soldiers did. Others had stopped believing in anything except survival, and they watched the Americans outside the walls with a growing sense that surrender might be the only rational choice left. But the commander would not allow it. His defiance, once absolute and inspiring, had become increasingly brittle. He no longer spoke of honor with confidence. He enforced it with threats. He patrolled the fortress looking for signs of weakness, punishing doubt as though it were desertion. The man who had promised to die for this position was now demanding others do the same, and his men were beginning to ask themselves a question that had no good answer. Were they following a hero? Or a man too stubborn to admit he was wrong? The Americans hadn't fired a shot in anger yet. They didn't need to. The real battle was happening inside the fortress walls, between resolve and reality, between obedience and survival. And reality was winning. When the bombardment began, it was not what the defenders expected. There was no rolling barrage, no saturation fire designed to pulverize everything inside the walls, no indiscriminate shelling meant to terrorize through volume and chaos. Instead, the first shell struck a specific firing port on the eastern wall. The second destroyed an observation post on the northern tower. The third collapsed a section of battlement where German machine gunners had been positioned. Each shot had a target. Each impact had a purpose. American artillery crews had spent days studying the fortress through binoculars and spotting scopes. They had mapped every defensive position, every aperture, every location where German troops might direct fire. They knew which walls were thickest, which angles offered the best trajectories, which positions mattered most to the fortress's ability to defend itself. Now, they were dismantling those positions one by one. Heavy guns were brought forward, 155mm artillery pieces positioned with direct line of sight to the fortress walls. Crews adjusted elevation and deflection with mathematical precision. Forward observers called corrections in real time, watching impact points and adjusting fire until shells were threading through windows and collapsing prepared defensive positions. This was not bombardment. It was surgery. The Germans quickly learned that returning fire was suicide. Every time a gun position revealed itself by firing, American artillery responded within minutes. Shells would arrive, precisely aimed, turning defensive advantages into death traps. Machine gun nests that had taken days to prepare were destroyed in seconds. The fortress was losing its teeth. Firing ports that had covered approaches were now rubble-choked gaps. Artillery pieces that could have swept the surrounding terrain sat silent, their crews unwilling to draw attention. Observation posts that provided early warning were shattered or abandoned. The defenders could still shoot, but every time they did, they paid for it immediately and disproportionately. American doctrine was clear. Firepower was a language, and the message being sent to the fortress was simple. Resistance accelerates your destruction. Days passed with this methodical pressure, not constant bombardment that would deplete ammunition stocks, but carefully timed strikes that destroyed capability while conserving resources. American gunners worked in shifts, maintaining readiness without exhaustion, applying force when it mattered most, inside the fortress. The psychological effect was devastating. The defenders weren't being overwhelmed by chaos. They were being erased by calculation. Every defensive advantage they'd counted on was being neutralized. Every position they fortified became a target. The stone walls that had promised protection now felt like a cage, solid enough to prevent escape, but unable to stop what was coming through. German soldiers crouched in interior chambers, away from firing ports and windows, listening to the sound of their fortress dying around them. Officers tried to organize repairs, but men were increasingly reluctant to expose themselves. Why rebuild a position that would only be destroyed again? The fortress still stood. But it was no longer a defensive position. It was a monument waiting for its final chapter. Patton's forces hadn't stormed the walls. They hadn't spent American lives in costly assaults. They had simply applied overwhelming, precise force in a way that made continued resistance pointless. The end was approaching. Everyone could feel it. But Patton was patient. He would apply pressure until reality became undeniable. The precision bombardment stopped. For 12 hours, the fortress sat in silence. No shells arrived. No gunfire echoed across the walls. American forces remained visible in their positions, but they weren't shooting, weren't advancing, weren't doing anything except waiting. The silence was worse than the shelling, because everyone inside the fortress understood what silence meant. The Americans were preparing for something final, something they wanted to ensure would work the first time. Rumors spread through the garrison like contagion. They're bringing up flamethrower tanks. They're preparing a gas attack. They have engineers tunneling under the walls. They're waiting for heavy bombers to level the entire position. None of the rumors could be confirmed. None could be dismissed. Men watched the American lines obsessively, searching for clues about what was coming, seeing everything and nothing at once. Every movement of vehicles, every repositioning of troops, every activity in the American camp became evidence of the next escalation. The not knowing was its own form of torture. German officers tried to maintain discipline through routine, but routine had lost its power. Morning inspections felt absurd. Equipment maintenance seemed pointless. Orders were followed mechanically, without conviction, because the alternative was open mutiny. The commander still spoke of duty and honor. He still referenced their oath, their cause, their obligation to resist. But his words landed differently now. They sounded hollow, defensive, desperate. His defiance had stopped inspiring confidence and started feeling like vanity. Men began to ask the question openly, not loudly, but no longer in whispers. What are we dying for? Not Germany. The war was clearly lost. Not this position. It had already been bypassed and neutralized. Not their comrades. Continued resistance only guaranteed more of them would die. They were dying for one man's refusal to admit he had been wrong. The cost of stubbornness was becoming undeniable. Some soldiers began preparing for the end in their own way. Letters were written and hidden, hoping they might be found and delivered. Personal items were secured. Quiet prayers were offered. Men made peace with outcomes their commander refused to accept. Others looked toward surrender with increasing desperation. They watched American positions, wondering if they could cross the open ground with white fabric raised before being shot. They debated in hushed voices whether collective surrender was possible if the commander refused to order it. Time, which had once been an ally, allowing for resupply, reinforcement, or rescue, had become an enemy. Every hour that passed brought them closer to whatever the Americans were preparing. Every minute spent in this fortress was a minute closer to annihilation. The defenders knew, with absolute certainty, that the Americans were not going to give up. They were not going to negotiate. They were not going to bypass the fortress and move on. Something was coming. Something worse than precision artillery. Something final. They could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon, inevitable, unstoppable, growing closer with every moment of silence. The only question was when, and whether their commander would allow them to surrender before they found out what Patton had been preparing all along. The decision came not with an explosion, but with a realization. The German commander stood in what remained of his command post, surrounded by maps that no longer mattered and reports that described a situation everyone already understood. His fortress still had ammunition. His men still had food. The walls, though damaged, still stood. But none of it mattered anymore. Through the shattered observation post, he could see American forces in final assault positions, heavy weapons trained on breaches in the walls, infantry units assembled and ready. The preparations were complete. Whatever was coming next would not be precision strikes designed to pressure surrender. It would be annihilation. His officers stood around him, silent. They had stopped offering suggestions days ago. They had stopped believing in miracles. They were simply waiting for their commander to acknowledge what they all knew. The vow he had made was about to cost lives that didn't need to be lost. The commander had built his identity around that vow. He had staked his honor, his reputation, his entire sense of self on the promise that he would never surrender. He had enforced it ruthlessly, punished those who questioned it, and convinced himself that resolve alone could change the mathematics of modern warfare. He had been wrong. The choice before him was simple and terrible. Order his men to fight in a battle that would accomplish nothing except their deaths, or break the oath that had defined him. Pride versus responsibility. Words versus lives. For a moment that stretched longer than any bombardment, he stood frozen between them. Then, quietly, with none of the drama that had accompanied his original refusal, he gave the order, "Raise the white flag." The words came out flat, drained of emotion. Not defiant, not resigned, simply final. Officers moved immediately, relieved and shocked in equal measure. White fabric was secured to a pole. Men were positioned to display it from the highest intact point on the fortress walls. The flag went up just as American guns were beginning their final preparations. Forward observers saw it. Calls went out across American positions. Guns that had been seconds from firing held. Infantry units that were preparing to advance held position. The machinery of destruction, fully engaged and ready, ground to a halt. The timing was dangerously close. Orders had already been given. Shells were loaded. Men were committed. Stopping the assault required urgent communication across multiple units, frantic calls to hold fire, immediate confirmation that the white flag was genuine and not a ruse. It stopped. Barely. Inside the fortress, German soldiers emerged from cover slowly, cautiously, uncertain whether the Americans would honor the surrender or unleash the attack anyway. Weapons were set aside. Hands were raised. Men who had prepared to die were now preparing to live. The commander emerged last, still in uniform, still upright, but carrying himself like a man who had lost something he could never recover. The words he had spoken days earlier, "You'll have to kill me," hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had consumed everything around it. They had not been fulfilled. Not because Patton lacked the will or capability to honor them, but because the commander himself had flinched at the final moment. The oath had collapsed. Reality had won. American troops entered the fortress expecting rubble and corpses. They found exhaustion and silence. The stone walls still stood, scarred but intact. Supplies remained stacked in storage chambers. Weapons sat arranged in neat rows where they had been placed after surrender. The fortress had not been destroyed. It had simply stopped resisting. German soldiers sat in clusters, no longer defenders, no longer combatants, just men waiting to be processed as prisoners of war. Some looked relieved, others looked hollow, none looked defiant. The commander stood apart, rigid and formal, maintaining the posture of authority even as authority itself drained away. When American officers arrived to accept the formal surrender, he saluted, stated his rank and unit, and said nothing else. There were no explanations, no justifications, no attempt to frame his defiance as anything other than what it had been: a miscalculation. Patton arrived hours later, not to gloat or lecture, but to assess the delay and resume operations. He walked through the fortress briefly, noting damage, casualties, and the time consumed, His demeanor was professional, almost indifferent. This had been an obstacle, nothing more. It had been removed. The war continued. He did not meet with the German commander. There was nothing to discuss. The entire engagement, from refusal to surrender, had delayed Patton's advance by less than a week. Supply convoys were already using the roads the fortress had threatened. Divisions that had been held in reserve were moving forward. The operational tempo resumed as though the fortress had never existed. In the broader context of the campaign, it was a footnote, a minor action, one of dozens of German positions that fell during the Allied advance across France. But the lesson it taught traveled farther than the bullets ever did. Other German commanders, facing similar encirclements and similar ultimatums, heard what had happened. They learned that Patton's offers of surrender were not negotiations. They were final chances. Refusal did not earn respect. Delay. It only determined how force would be applied. Some chose differently. They surrendered their garrisons, spared their men, and ended engagements that could not be won. Others, perhaps out of loyalty or ideology or simple stubbornness, chose defiance, and discovered that Patton treated all such declarations the same way. As instructions, the fortress had promised to be an immovable object. It had declared that surrender was impossible, that only death would end its resistance. And for days, it seemed as though those words carried weight, as though dramatic vows could alter the trajectory of modern war. They could not. Defiance without leverage is not strength. It is simply delay. And delay, against an opponent with overwhelming force and absolute clarity of purpose, is only a slower route to the same end. Patton had not punished the German commander for his vow. He had not been offended or insulted. He had simply accepted the terms as stated and prepared to honor them exactly. The fact that the commander surrendered at the final moment did not change the fundamental equation. Words spoken in war have consequences. They shape how enemies respond. They determine what happens next. And Patton, more than most commanders of his era, understood that the clearest words were also the most dangerous, not because they provoked violence, but because they removed alternatives. The fortress fell, the war moved on, and the lesson remained, carved into history as permanently as those stone walls. When you tell Patton what he'll have to do, he takes you at your word.